There we go. Welcome. Thank you all for coming to the College of Public Service Brown Bag Talk. Today we will be talking about social movements, and we will be having students present on their analysis of a social movement. I believe we also have an alumni that's going to drop in and talk about her experience when she did this assignment too. But I am Dr. Cynthia George. I teach in the social work program here in the College of Public Service. And in my undergraduate, when I taught undergraduate policy and now graduate, I have my students analyze social movements, and we explore how social movements have been used to create change throughout time. And today, Maggie Canby, who is a graduate student, is going to be presenting on her work. I want to do just a little overview of the model that we're going to use. And then when I stop talking and Maggie takes over, I'm going to drop the agenda as a PDF into the chat, as well as a couple of other links that you all can access. These slides too. But first, I just want to talk for a little bit about the model. We use Herbert Blumer's 4-stage model for analyzing a social movement. And I focus on helping the students learn how to even apply a scientific analysis model to do that sort of thinking. And they write an essay. And then I also have them do a presentation, an oral presentation with PowerPoint slides, and create a mini zine. And we're going to be talking about mini zines a little bit later. But the model that we use, you're going to hear Maggie talk about social movements as they emerge, which is normally some sort of discontent, and people are unhappy about something. Sometimes there's a tragedy, like George Floyd, right, that brings people together. And then there's coalescence, right, or people may come together around that idea or around that rage, that righteous anger, that desire for change. And then the movements will move through bureaucratization, where movements begin to formalize and create goals, and then decline, which does not necessarily mean failure. It just means that the rise up of the tension for the movement begins to either level out, and it either creates the change that it wanted to create, or it modifies its goals, or it can actually decline or fail and cease to be. And that gets pretty complicated, but it talks about repression and how external forces can repress the movement, co-optation, how leaders basically can be co-opted, right, or bought out. The movement can be bought out. And then, of course, success, right, in different ways that social movements can deem success, whether it's through they're stopping the actions that they were trying to stop or achieving policy goals, because these are very closely related to policy when you achieve success. And then failure, it's often due to factionalism, where the leaders kind of break off, or they form different opinions about what success might mean, or they become encapsulated and no one can infiltrate or get in. And so the movement becomes sort of isolated. And then sometimes the movements just become established with the mainstream. And so that's sort of the definition of the model. And again, I'm going to link some things in for those of you that want more information, but I don't want to focus too much on that. That's just so that you can understand. I want to focus on the work of our wonderful, wonderful students. And I am going to start by introducing Maggie Canby, who is a graduate student. And I was very impressed with her work. She has studied the Incel movement. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, Maggie.
Thanks, Dr. George. And once again, thank you so much for inviting me to share today. As Dr. George said, I am presenting on the Incel movement, which goes a little against the righteous anger that was discussed. I kind of like that it went more that it went for a movement that is not necessarily positive in society. Go ahead. Can everybody see my screen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. The Incel movement is a growing social movement consisting of predominantly young, white, heterosexual men, and it threatens the safety of the American public, especially its women. These angry, entitled men who claim to be involuntary celibates, or incels, promote, threaten, and incite violence to punish those they blame for their lack of romantic success. The incel movement is part of the growing anti-feminist manosphere, which includes other groups like the men's rights activists. Incels blame feminism, women's sexual liberation, women's ability to choose their own partners for the incel's own loneliness and humiliation of their perceived or actual rejection. They believe that since they are not selected as partners, women should not be able to have a choice in their own partners. Now, historically, misogynistic and anti-feminist violence against women has long existed, but the internet has provided a new way for isolated and resentful men to connect. Congregating mostly online, self-proclaimed incels frequently threaten violence and against women as retaliation for their own situations, and lone incel perpetrators are responsible for violent attacks with as many as 40 to 50 casualties in North America and the UK in just the last 10 years. These attacks are meant to intimidate society into either taking away women's sexual freedom, or if they view that as a hopeless cause, to punish those they blame for their feelings of rejection. And between the online self-reinforcement of their ideas and the radicalization within the community, incel violence is on the rise. As Dr. George discussed, Blumer's four-stage model of the social movement includes phases of emergence, coalescence, bureaucratization, and decline. Through this lens, the development and evolution of the incel movement can be seen in its emergence from isolated individuals to communities of the lonely, the coalescence of the radicalized, its lack of bureaucratization, and the need for repression to signal its decline. The term involuntary celibate was coined by a Canadian woman named Alana in the 90s. She created Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project as an inclusive online peer forum for, quote, anybody of any gender who was lonely, had never had sex, or hadn't had a relationship in a long time, end quote. It was a safe and welcoming online community. She left that community in 2000, and over time, it was no longer a place for benevolent incels. The forum was appropriated by heterosexual men who, instead of looking for support, were looking to blame others for their loneliness and low self-worth. Eventually, other such forums were created, and many of these incels who displayed their content through anger and frustration migrated to places like 4chan and loveshy.com, where they could post freely without moderators who banned talk of blame or misogyny. The introduction of internet forums is instrumental in the emergence of the incel movement because it provided places where lonely people could connect behind the safety of a screen and a username. They finally felt comfortable joining a community to congregate and converse after feeling like they had nowhere else to go. They were not alone in the way they were feeling, and they felt a solidarity and a sense of belonging, with which came a certain amount of pride in this identity. Men were receiving confirmation from each other that being physically unattractive was the root of their problems and why women would reject them. This cause, in quotes, gave the delusion of victimhood to these men and taints their view of women as a whole, as the rejection by one woman is a rejection by all women, and therefore all women are cruel. The voices of the angry were the loudest and began to dominate these forums. And the insulation and the self-reinforcing nature of these forums set incels up for radicalization. Extremist posts gather the attention that they crave, which encourages more and more extremist posts. The coalescence stage of the incel movement is marked not by the physical coalescence of the incels, but by the radicalization of the movement and the calls for actual punishment of those responsible for their sexual and social woes. The movement's radicalization began with the, with the violence committed by Elliot Rodger in his 2014 killing spree in California. He killed 6 and injured 14 before completing suicide, and he left behind a manifesto describing how his retribution was to punish women for his own virginity. By proclaiming himself an incel, he brought the cause and the ideology to the nation's attention. His manifesto was a consolidated written documentation of the radicalized incel ideology. This, along with his YouTube videos, provided a clearly defined sense of discontent around which there was more extreme incels that coalesced and formed a collective identity. His public message also attracted new men to the forums who agreed with his ideas. The attack changed the movement's trajectory, changing it from an angry digital community to one that threatens actual violence. Lone perpetrators have followed in his footsteps, carrying out mass violence and declaring similar motivations in their inceldom. They strive for his notoriety, some directly naming him as inspiration, and he is held up as a true incel hero, being called the supreme gentleman. And he is worshipped much like a martyr for the cause. One incel writing, quote, "Spread that name, speak of his sacrifice for our cause, worship him for he gave his life for our future," end quote. Rogers is held up as a true incel hero, much like a martyr. And the radicalized incels are now wishing for actual punishment of sexually active men and women, which they call Chad and Stacy's. This is part of their adopted vocabulary, which also has words like rage fuel and black pill, in which they discuss their concepts amongst themselves. Their forums are self-radicalizing because of their normalization of calls for violent punishment and of extremist rhetoric. The conversations have taken a more nihilistic tone, discussing women in shockingly derogatory, dehumanizing, and vitriolic words. They do not see Chads and Stacys as people, but as hypersexual repressors who are violently punished in their own twisted revenge fantasies. Feminists were the reason for their rejection and their humiliation, and for that, incels felt their retribution was justified. Bureaucratization, or lack thereof. The incel movement does not fit into the bureaucratization phase of Blumer's social model, as it lacks formal organization, specifically in that its most centralized communication and exchanges of ideas are done in anonymous online forums. The community, or so-called brothers, are not physically in the same location, and many do not know each other's identities. They are also spread out throughout the world. While there is a perceived and somewhat subjective hierarchy within the radicalized community with, for example, true cells, which are those who are such true incels that they'll never ascend from that status, there is no bureaucratic power over other members. Forum moderators are the only ones with banning power, and that power only extends to their own forum. There is, they are subject to the hosting website's terms and conditions for their forums. So they're not their own identity or entity. And any incel-owned websites are just an extension of the decentralized online community. Further, attacks carried out by incels have been committed by lone perpetrators, not community organization. In chasing notoriety, their attacks and public messages have the manifest motive of explaining the violence and striking fear into the Stacys and Chads of the world, with the latent motive of rocketing the perpetrator into martyrdom and granting him the recognition he never had in his life. Many of the perpetrators complete or plan to complete suicide after their attacks. While martyrs can inspire action, they cannot lead. Incel movement is also not conducive to former structure because many of the members would leave the community if their circumstances changed. It is an inherent problem in the movement that if an incel is able to form a romantic relationship, then he is technically no longer an incel. Further, there is actually a growing trend of incels undergoing dramatic plastic surgery to physically transform themselves into the Chads that they seemingly hate. The lack of formalization and centralization adds to the threat of incel violence, because without these ways to track the movement, law enforcement struggles to locate individuals that may be planning to carry out threats. When so many of the radicalized incels are making generalized anonymous threats, it's difficult to decipher which ones are serious. It may be a small minority of the incels who actually carry out violence, but those who have sought to produce as much carnage as possible. There's a need for social workers to fight for social justice through the repression of this movement. The incel movement continues to gain alarming momentum in today's society, which means the movement has not yet reached its full decline phase. Rather, action must be taken to ensure it declines because it is repressed, rather than it becoming a success or being integrated into mainstream culture. It may seem implausible that such hatred would become the mainstream, but nothing can be taken for granted. Inaction allows this hatred to flow into societal acceptance. The incel attacks and threats of violence are gender and sex-based domestic terrorism, and they need to be treated as such. The US Patriot Act defines domestic terrorism as, quote, activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, and appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, end quote. This includes the mass violence perpetrated by incels, but also their everyday violence, ranging from harassment and the assault of women. Trying to repress the incel movement is a complicated task because the movement's nature, it would be exhaustive of resources to locate and physically surveil those who make generalized threats, as many incels make empty threats to rile up one another. For most, their weapon of choice is their keyboard. There's also a gray area when it comes to citizens' rights, with questions about free speech and what constitutes a legitimate threat. Private companies have the authority to enforce policies against hate or inciting violence and monitor their own forums. But historically, once an incel community is banned from one website, it will just set up in another medium. They will continue to move and move until they reach the dark web, which fosters an environment which can further extremism and can grow in the dark. Forcing them into the shadows will fertilize their fantasies and plans of domestic terrorism, not hinder it. Policies are needed to fight against the growth of the incel movement. To counter the incel movement, New America, a public policy think tank, recommends increased access to mental health programs and services in early intervention. It recommends the development of intervention programs that specialize in countering violence, working with gender justice programs, and increased funding and protection for those studying male supremacy. Social work is a very vital part of repressing the incel movement. It is the duty of social workers to challenge and fight to repress this movement because of the profession's ethical values, principles, standards, and responsibility. The Code of Ethics outlines the values of service, social justice, dignity, and the dignity and worth of the person as some of the foundations of the profession. With the rights and safety of human beings being threatened by this movement, social workers must work to help people in need and to address social problems, challenge social injustice, and respect the inherent dignity and worth of those around them. If working with clients who subscribe to the incel ideology, the clinician must also seek to resolve conflicts between clients' interests and the broader society's interests in a socially responsible manner, consisting with the values, ethical principles, and ethical standards of the profession. Social workers also have ethical responsibilities to the broader society, which includes social and political action. It is the responsibility of social workers to act to prevent and eliminate the domination of, exploitation of, and discrimination against any person, group, or class, and in this case, based on the basis of sex. The fight against the incel movement and for social justice is an immediate obligation. The current political climate, especially with the anti-feminism movements and the manosphere gaining traction within the last few years, threatens the dignity and safety of our citizens. It is the social workers' duty to confront both casual and violent misogyny. And unfortunately, there is continued work to be done. And I already flipped towards it, but this is the zine that I made for the project as well. And when it's folded, The Dangers of the Incel Movement is the title page. And it's just a way for a person who is reading it to see the dangers of how misogyny is not to be taken lightly. So it says stuff like incels have radicalized committing and inciting violence against women. They hide behind the computer, but their threats are real. The general theme is that people have a tendency to laugh at anyone who's angry because they're lonely, just in general, not specific people, but it can be dangerous when it is part of a community that has radicalized. And it's not something to be taken lightly when people are threatening the health and well-being of others. So that's all I have. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Maggie. You make me so proud. I enjoy this assignment so much and seeing the work of our students. Before I turn it over to questions from the group, I do want, Jailyn, are you ready to say something? I have an alumni here that participated. And I just want to share real briefly what a mini zine is. I did drop some things into the chat. And Jailyn, I'm going to introduce this and then show yours as an example. So hang on just a second. Thank you so much to Director Glenda Alvin from TSU Libraries, who saw the flyer for this event and reached out to me and said, let's make a journal. And so I'm so happy to announce that with the help of Matt Sherman and some other folks at TSU's Libraries, we now have the Online Journal of Zines about social movements titled Creating Change. And students, this is all back issues of student zines since I've been teaching the course 2019, 2020, 21, and 2022. So I'm going to start by showing this 2022, and I'm going to show this video here by Anthony Williams because it shows what a mini zine is and what it looks like when it's all folded up. And there is no sound, but you see his was about Black Lives Matter. And where Maggie chose to go very artistic and use images, he chose to go very model, right? And kind of write an explanation of what each one of the stages of the model meant for the Black Lives Matter movement. And you can check that out rather than showing the whole thing, right? I'm going to go ahead and let's see, kind of go back. And so we have the lovely Miss Jailyn Crumb, who is a TSU alum, and she did this zine, right? When you look at the zines as they're created, this is what they look like. I'm not sure how well you can see this or how I can make it bigger, right? But you can download that. I did put the link, right? But it creates this little title page, which is beautiful. And this is something that students can put on their CVs and their resumes. And this is Miss Jailyn Crumb's zine, where she spoke about children's rights when she did this assignment. Jailyn, would you like to say something?
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be back and see some old faces and, this morning. But most importantly, when I look at the zine and look back, at my experience, thank you, Maggie, for revisiting that for me. But it implements itself now currently in that, I did all my research, and really analyze what is the children's rights movement, why, what's so important about it, and so when I chose these images for it specifically, it actually implements now what I'm doing within practice. And that, I'm actually working with children, teenage youth girls that are in foster care. And so I'm the full-time weekend case manager. So to see, all the research that I accumulated, within my undergraduate experience until now, in graduate school now and working, with these girls that have been through trauma-informed care, it all correlates together. So I really want to thank you, Dr. George, for explaining what a zine was, because of course we all were like, well, what is a zine? I've never heard of this. But it really expanded my thought process. It expanded my view, my awareness, anything correlated within social work, our principles, our core values, our ethics, our competencies, all that we learned in undergrad really comes together and unfolds the further we enter our careers. So just overall within the children's rights movement, it came together for me now, even moving forward, not just with children, but even adolescents, but really in my moment when I said, I wanted to do children's rights, and to be able to expand upon that now, it's amazing. So I'm just glad to be able to come back, as an alum, and kind of give my spill of where I am in life, and to see, like I said, old professors and new people, that I've never seen, to kind of give my insight on my experience. But, I wish you all the best of luck for those who are graduating in a couple of weeks. And so, yeah, just embark upon your journey, and just put everything you have into everything that you've done and continue to do in the future as a social worker. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jailyn, for coming in and sharing about this. And this is an assignment. I have so much fun with it. I learn so much. And I really rather than I did want to kind of show these zines real quick. These were that was Jailyn's, right? Some of these, this is The Haitian Refugee Crisis by April Reynolds. And I'll tell you, this semester, this one will not fold in the traditional way that a mini zine will, but I took it anyways because it's COVID and this is art, right? And so this one won't fold, but the traditional way to fold a mini zine would. But this was still just topical, and so I chose to publish all of those in the journal. This one was on the Afro-Latin movement, Afro-Latina, or Afro-Latinx, right? The Natural Hair Movement by Shanice McGregor. This is hand-drawn, which I love, right? You can hand draw these, you can digitally do these, you can type on these. And I love that one. The Dangers of the Incel Movement, right here is Maggie's, as published. This was just on Black Power in general and the Black Power movement. And this one here, which was great, right? All drawn with a Sharpie, but just so great. And I'll tell you, these zines actually can be sold. This one would be highly sought after at a zine fest, right? And they have these all across the country. And they'll sell them. This one will probably go for 75 cents at least, which is a lot for a little mini zine, and people go around and trade them. And then Mentoring the 100 Way, right? This one also would not fold properly. It looks more like an Instagram ad, but it was beautiful, and so I published it. And then Mothers Against Drunk Driving here, right? And so there is that. That is the little zine review. And then I just want to open it up to everyone for questions. Who's got something to say?
This is Glenda Alvin from the library. I just wanted to add that the zines are searchable through Google and all search engines, so they're accessible from around the world. Researchers will be able to acquire them for their research, and then each author will get a report on the number of downloads for their particular article. So that way it's also used as the way of what we call our open access publishing, so that people can get their research out. It doesn't have to be in a formal journal or a peer-reviewed journal, but the research is there for people who want to access it.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Winters?
Yes, thank you very much, Maggie. That was incredible. That was an amazing job that you did. And I am just floored by your analysis of this, what I would call a very interesting social movement in and of itself, because I don't think that a lot of us really have paid much attention to this social movement, and to get this kind of analysis has really kind of expanded my mind. So thank you for that. What was coming up for me through this, because somehow my brain, as you were analyzing the movement, I kept on going back to this book that I read many years ago, and don't ask me to quote anything in it because it was so long ago. But there was this book called Backlash, and something by Susan Faludi, back in the early 1990s. And it was introduced to me as this kind of how social movements emerge out of this push for feminism, right? And do you think, and what I kept on going back to is that this incel movement, to some degree, is just almost like a morphed, really dangerous backlash to feminism. If you really kind of look at it in context, is that what you get from this movement to some degree, that it's just a backlash to feminism?
I think that's a great way to put it. It's a warped backlash to feminism, because in feminism, you want equal rights. Women want the same rights as men have. And somehow the self-proclaimed, that's also another thing that I thought was very interesting, because they're self-proclaimed and they find pride in that identity. So it's not like you're just accusing a bunch of people of being incels. The dangerous ones are the ones that self-proclaim, but they're making feminism about themselves. And it's a very unhealthy thinking that it's like, well, you want rights, but you're going to be taking them away from me, what I want. And I don't think feminism has as much, it's pointing out the need for feminism more than anything, because
Exactly.
I should have the right to my own body and choices. And you saying that that makes you feel bad and therefore I'm not allowed to do it is very warped thinking to me personally.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very extreme element of that kind of general backlash to feminism. And we've seen kind of a reemergence of this in our culture, which brings me to my next question, and then I'll let other people ask questions. But one thing, when you brought up, you know, as a clinician, you know, occasionally I have encountered people who have dramatically different views than I do. You know, just general life views, religious views, political views, whatever the case may be. And generally, it's not a cultural phenomenon. It is what it is, and you know, we stay focused on what it is that brought them in for help, as opposed to kind of these ancillary issues. But what I see has emerged, you know, is this question about how do you deal with a client who has not just opposing views to your own as a social worker, but that may overplay in work that you do with them, where it continuously comes up, this rhetoric, right? And I think about this when you're you know, dealing with all sorts of different clients. So if I was a clinician, social worker, working with someone who ascribed to this movement, what would be your best approach if it continuously came up? You know, that this rhetoric was part of the dialogue in this kind of therapeutic or whatever kind of role you're playing, this relationship that you've established with this client. Is it a culture in and of itself requiring then as a social worker to develop cultural competence with respect to the incel movement? Or is it something that needs to be addressed directly as kind of opposing forces? Do you understand that question?
I believe I understand it. I am not sure I have an answer for it, because I do think it is a gray area as far as how ingrained they are into the kind of culture of the movement. And, you know, if it's somebody that likes some of the ideology and that's holding up different aspects of their life, like blaming others for unhappiness, and, you know, there's ways around it. But if they're ascribed heavily into it, I don't know how far we would have to do cultural competence, because there is a point where it is just completely different thinking, and it might not be, well, the person may not be willing to look past those things. And I'm not, then it comes to the argument of, is it a culture? Because should I even be trying to, even if it's harmful? So it's a very gray area,
It
except for the
is.
ones that, because also if they're online saying these things, we as social workers won't necessarily know. So we may not know the depth, and we also can't look at their social media or anything like that. So we won't necessarily know the depth of their feelings, or if they're just like, yeah, women shouldn't have rights to their own body or choices. We won't know any of that. So, I mean, I guess it would be a case by case basis.
I know, right?
I will
That's what
inter-
was coming up for me.
well,
Yeah.
I will interject, Maggie. I think you did a great job of taking that very complicated question that really is for an advanced clinician, right? And but really the answer is you go to Google and you type in best practices for treating incels, and there actually is a manual for that. But it looks like there's not a lot in the journal databases, and so that means there's not a lot of actual efficacy studies or effectiveness studies, but there is a growing amount of literature. Now, I figured that out in 3 minutes, so I mean, there are people that have more expertise than that, but you'd have to treat it the same way that you would treat any perspective of violence towards any group, right? People, I mean, and there are techniques for that. I'm not a clinician, right? But I mean, there are techniques ultimately for helping people to address violence. And a lot of it depends on why are they seeking treatment. And if they're seeking treatment to deal with the fact that they want relationship improvement, then you would use the techniques and practices for improving relationships. If they are seeking treatment because I've got in trouble online because I've been banned from Facebook for posting misogynistic posts, right? Then you would use those techniques for cyberbullying, right? And so it's not that different than other treatment modalities that we have for preventing thoughts of violence against women, right? Or violence, I mean, and it's about taking those strategies and adapting them for this population. And it looks to me like there's actually plenty of room for scholarship in that area, where someone, an eager clinician, Maggie, as you go on with your career, could publish in that area. Somebody, it looks like they're making $128 off of this book, I mean, and so it is something that is becoming more important, which is why I'm so proud that Maggie chose to pick a hard movement, because we do think about social movements traditionally as those that are trying to improve society, right? But improve is a perspective. And, and so there are a lot of sort of alt-right movements that we know of today that have kind of inverted what it means to be a social movement. And we've seen the nature of protest change over time, where we might have a protest for Black Lives Matter, and then we also might have a protest for don't force me to wear a mask, right? Like at the same time, I mean, and they're using those same techniques to accomplish things that are on traditionally opposite sides of the political spectrum. Does that make sense, right? It's becoming really, really complex. But the techniques that social movements use for change, which are emergence, coalescence, bureaucratization, right? Those stay the same. And the reason it's so important for social workers to recognize, do we need to support this movement or do we need to repress it? And so that we're aware of it, because a lot of social workers aren't even aware of the incel movement or how it may be impacting our clients. Like, is that even on an assessment? Are you part of any like dark web chat rooms? I mean, and so really, I'd say it's an emerging area of practice. But I will open the floor up to anyone else.
Thank you, Maggie, for this presentation. It was amazing.
Thank you.
Dr. Streams? Oh, I'm sorry, or Dr. Montgomery, if you want to go, and then Dr. Streams.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't get my camera to work. I mean, I'm pushing that button, but it isn't working. But anyway, you can hear me, I presume.
Yes.
And my question was very similar to Dr. Winters, and also the comments that you just made about treating this, because And Maggie, I want to tell you, this is the first time that I have heard this term incel. I must confess to you, I'm not familiar with it, but it is very disturbing. And from my perspective, let me tell you why, because some of these folks may be arrested. And if it's through the Patriot Act, of course, they may end up in a federal prison system or whatever. And I'm concerned about how popular these guys are going to become among their fellow offenders. That happens. And it could be a breeding ground for more of these kinds of folks. And so the necessity for treatment is, in my view, very important. And I'm glad to hear, Dr. George, that there are those, but we need to make sure that those things are making their way into the prison. And I would be very interested in knowing how many of these incel characters maybe have a criminal justice background. And but anyway, there's all sorts of questions there that I have. But thank you for informing us of this very interesting social movement. I must tell you, it's great. And prior to this presentation, I had to look up Blumer's model of social movements. And gosh, I saw a lot of criticisms and so on and so forth, but it makes perfect sense to me, the 4 points and all that. I really like that. It's quite interesting. So anyway, now, do you have students in social work that are pursuing their theses? You don't have a PhD, I don't think, over there, but pursuing their thesis kind of on these models, or what about that?
We do not have a PhD program in social work. However, if you have any in criminal justice, I'd be willing to serve on as a chairperson on their dissertation committee to help that. And of course, that's something that as TSU develops towards an R1, maybe we will be part of. But I definitely am open to talking to you in other ways where we can have our social work and criminal justice students working together to explore these topics, because they are about understanding risk factors and screening for, are they in these dangerous movements? And then we also need to know what are the supportive movements that are going to be pushing us towards social justice so that we can support those and enhance those. Because, you know, the best practices for creating change can be used by any polity, right, or any group that wants to create change. And so we have to make sure that we're properly equipping those that are working for justice with the best tools available to both build our own movements and thwart the other movements that are seeking against justice. But yes, let's talk.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, I had one more question for Maggie, if I could, just a real quick one, and it's a little bizarre, but let's try it. We all know from our research and our PhDs and so on, that sometimes people who have idiosyncratic propensities, like the incel people, they attract other people because of, you know, what they are. And I'm wondering, this is kind of weird, if some of these guys might attract females. You know what I'm saying? They may attract them because, oh, look at this guy's he's on the web. He's got his own website. He's powerful. He's sending out this message and all of that kind of thing. And if so, that's a shame. But anyway, do you see any research, Ms. Canby, on that, or?
I didn't see any specifically on that in my research, but I will say that there is some of the subjective hierarchy. Some incels believe that women can't be incels. They believe that they'll call them femcells, but they use it in a derogatory term. And I personally think that that would be the only, I would kind of personally hope, I guess, would be the only women that would be attracted to that, because so much of what they say is hatred towards women.
Yeah.
But once again, I did not see anything specific to that in my research.
Dr. Montgomery, I'll add to that, that the deep roots of the incel movement do come from, there's a larger men's rights movement, which is, and I'll caution against using the word backlash of feminism, because the backlash places the blame on feminism, and instead it's like a reactionary movement to feminism, where men are trying to assert their rights, or it's and people using identity politics now and to try to control things. But there are a group of women that support the men's rights movement, and they call themselves beavers. And so they actually, if you go online, you'll see a lot of stuff. They're their own dark web chat rooms, and they are, I would say, a lot of internalized oppression against women, and really they just uphold the beliefs that women are supposed to be sex objects for men, or they're supposed to, like, that's part of our role or our responsibility, and they're fine with that, and they find power in that. And so there is some, I don't know, the specific group of incels is kind of like a subset of that are very focused on the sexual activity.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Streams, yes.
First, I want to say again, as others have said, thank you so much, Maggie, and thank you also to Jailyn for sharing your work on both topics. And Maggie, your presentation was just excellent. So I will say this is a topic that has got nothing to do with my area of expertise, so just take that on advisement. I think it's important for faculty to be clear when they are and aren't speaking in their area of expertise. But as a layperson, I've followed this movement for a number of years, and I've read a lot of analyses of it in, the lay press. I've read some of the documents of the people, the manifesto and so forth. But of course, with the disorganized thing as decentralized, there's no one perspective or whatever that's like the orthodoxy. But I guess one of the reasons it's always interested me is because of the way that it co-opts some of the ideas of evolutionary biology. I have a biology background, and my partner's an evolutionary biologist. And the people in the movement really use a lot of ideas out of that, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes not that misunderstood, but misapplied, I guess, in a human context, we might say. And in that sense, it reminds me of how ideas from society get picked up, and evolutionary ideas have been picked up and used in all kinds of ways in social movements, with the most obvious example being eugenics, right? In the late 1800s and the earlier part of the 20th century. But I guess what I did really like about your talk was that you brought up the idea of loneliness, because I think seeing this movement as just one more type of backlash against feminism and one more kind of anti-woman perspective is probably not going to have anything to do with solving it, because it's part of this epidemic, I think, of loneliness. And you brought up the idea of loneliness. And one of the challenges is that we happen to be living in a time where so many forces in society that no one person controls, no one government controls, no one group of people controls, is pushing us into an atomistic existence that is very alienating. And so I guess the bigger question is, what happens when a social movement, there are times when social movements represent like the future, and they're coming toward, like civil rights movement, maybe, it's like bringing the future and making the future come sooner in a good way, forcing policy changes through long struggles and so forth, so that we move in a better direction societally. But this movement is more like a symptom of processes in society that are not easy to address with policy. Like there's no solution. You just get rid of Twitter, or you get rid of Discord, or you get rid of Reddit, and something else is there, right? And all those tools have positive uses as well. So lots of activists use those tools, not just activists we disagree with. So we have the research that shows that people, the better looking you are, the better you generally do in life. You get paid more, it's a kind of hyper ableist thing, right? I mean, you're fortunate if you don't have what society considers a disfigurement, but you're more fortunate and you have better life outcomes if you're attractive by whatever the societal standards are. That's reality. There are lots of data to show that. So some of what these men are responding to, and maybe some of what a lot of women and people of various gender identities are responding to online with the constant makeup tutorials and the constant focus on appearance, is societal trends that are accelerating that. Now dating is flipping on a thing, looking at somebody's picture. That's not going to solve their problem, right? Because the weight put on physical attractiveness is even higher. So I guess my question is, what if this movement isn't as easy to extinguish as just saying, well, it's another kind of anti-feminism and they just don't want women to have rights, and say, this is these people living out something that all humans seek, which is community and acceptance. And in a society that's moving away from them being able to find it in traditional ways, they're finding it in untraditional ways. So what's a societal solution to that? It's not going to be as simple as a single law or rights act or anything like that. So just interested in your thoughts.
I do think you hit the nail on the head on the human, just the unified human wanting to belong, acceptance, all that. We all crave that. We're social animals. I mean, all being a very generalized term, but I do think you mentioned social media. I do think social media has perpetuated a way of, if I could just have that person's life, then I would be happy. And everything's kind of face value. And I think this might play into it a little bit. There's obviously deeper roots, but like if a woman just found me attractive, then it would be okay, but she doesn't. So that's why my life isn't good. And it does, I do think it's not something that we can extinguish, like you said. Like we can't take away things that have multi uses, like you said Reddit, and Reddit actually banned the Incel subreddit in 2017, I believe. They banned it and they moved to a different forum. They can continue, like, it's not like we can just be like, okay, well, let's get rid of Twitter, because you'll deprive some people that are trying to use it for good, but also you can't just take away the internet. There'll always be somewhere to go. And because there's not a way to really target it, it is something that we just can't extinguish. I think, unfortunately, it has to be, I mean, domestic terrorism has to be dealt with like domestic terrorism, but I do think like clinicians might have to, or social workers might have to work with people as they face them, but it's not like you can seek people out and force them to do any kind of treatment. So I don't really have a response to it, but I do think you made some very good points that I truly agree with.
You have taken some really tough questions today, Maggie, from some really smart people that, but I would have to say that I agree with a lot of what you were saying, Dr. Streams, in that even as a raging feminist, And I'm not a beaver, right? I'm not part of that class, but I do understand where the men's rights movement is coming from. And I do understand the criticisms of identity politics and how we're going to have to find ways to move past them, and where progress for women doesn't become oppression for men. Right. I mean, and so a lot of that has to come to do with it. And I don't know what to do about lookism. Right. Like, but I mean, again, there are treatment modalities for that. And if that is an aspect of what that person is dealing with, then we do have to have proper screening, which I do think a lot of it's going to be law enforcement screening and even getting people into treatment for this sort of stuff, because I don't think people think about it in terms of, I don't know that your average incel is sitting around thinking, oh, well, I could go and get treatment for my relationship issues, or I could just use all this hate. And they probably don't even have access to treatment for that to even be an option. So, I don't know. I think we've got to look at the system wide, and we are wrapping up on time. I want to Rebecca Chandler has brought some things up in the chat. She says that there is a musical called Octet with a song called Solo, which explores the juxtaposition between an incel and a sex positive woman, right? A woman that is trying to claim her sexual power, and an incel that wants to still control it. And then also she's asking a question if there's any evidence of trans involvement in the incel movement. And I'll tell you that it's actually quite interesting there. The actual trans people that are having a legitimate transition, no. But there is a reaction within the men's rights movement and the incel movement called, where people begin to claim their gender as an Apache attack helicopter. Has anybody heard that? It's pretty large, right? And I actually process data from teenagers, and I'll tell you, the state of Rhode Island, I get more people saying that their gender is an Apache attack helicopter, like up to 30% of the sample sometimes, right? And so it is a big movement, and it is part of these dark web chat rooms where that language come from. That's also where the electric boogaloo comes from, right? Or like the trying to go back to the, start at the next civil war. And so a lot of these sort of dangerous movements are coming from these dark chat rooms, and they are offshoots of this greater sort of struggle to balance men's rights, right? And to make sure that those are there. And so we are going to have to find some way. We can't just cut men out of society. We are going to have to find some way to build a bridge better. But we also can't allow progress to be compromised because of these fringe extremists that can't handle change. And because change is just a natural part of human evolution, and they do need treatment. They do deserve dignity and respect as human beings, but they also can't co-opt the greater movement for civil rights and change. And I think it's 11:30. I think that we should end right there. Thank you so much, Maggie, and thank you very much for everyone that came to support our students and attend this session.